Hi everybody, Professor H here. Welcome to our video for Chapter 5, Part 1, Physical Development in Toddlerhood. Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started with our screen share. Okay, Chapter 5, Part 1, Physical Development in Toddlerhood. We're going to take a look at physical changes in growth, toilet training, and weaning. Those are basically what we're going to look at in this brief video. In toddlerhood, children still grow very rapidly. They do grow a bit slower than in infancy, but still pretty darn fast. They also start to lose what we call baby fat. Our infants kind of have that roly-poly look to them. They look a little pudgy, a little chubby. And as they get into toddlerhood, they start losing that baby fat. One of the reasons for this is that they can regulate their temperature better. They do not need as much body fat in order to regulate their temperature. They become longer and leaner, which also helps prepare them for walking. The rest of their body grows quite a bit faster than the head. As you remember, humans are born with a very large head compared to other mammals. When an infant is born, their head is 1/4 of their entire length of their body. By the time we have a toddler at 2 years old, their head is 1/5 of their entire body length. And by the time we reach adulthood, our head only consists of about 1/8 of our adult length, or height, I guess we could call it. This weird looking graph here is showing a comparison of head size, of relative head size at different ages. So if our baby was the same height as an adult, see we have our adult over here on the end. If our baby was the same size as an adult, this is how he would look. This is the weirdo proportions that they would have, like any good alien from an alien movie. They've got the giant head and this weird looking body and these short little nubby legs. So our infants, 1/4 of their body height here is made up of head. As we grow and mature, the size of our head in relation to the rest of our body changes until we are at about 1/8 of our entire height here, that is our head. Anyway, that's just kind of an interesting comparison. In developing countries and developed countries, growth takes place at about the same rate for the first 6 months. After that, and this is great, a lot of this is due to the mother breastfeeding and being able to provide adequate nutrition through breastfeeding for that first 6 months. After that period, when the baby is weaning, or in some countries due to the mother being unable to produce milk after this period of time, we start to see some differences in the development of toddlers. After 6 months, 1/4 of children worldwide lack sufficient protein. That is the biggest problem worldwide with children over 6 months of age, is a lack of sufficient protein. This protein promotes slower growth. So they will not grow at as rapid a pace as a child who is consuming sufficient amounts of protein. Oftentimes this might happen if we are in an area of the world where after weaning, or maybe the mother has had another child, and that younger child at 9, 10 months, or even a year old is starting to wean, they are expected to eat some rice, some other types of meals that do not have adequate protein in them. And they will share these meals with other children. And because of this food source being inadequate in protein, they don't develop properly. This particular type of deficit leads to something called kwashiorkor, and I hope I pronounced that right. Every year I get it all wrong. This particular, this particular deficit, this condition occurs with the deficit of protein. We looked at marasmus previously. Marasmus was an overall nutrition deficit. So you would see a child that looks very thin and emaciated, very skinny, very skeletal. That's what you would see with marasmus. With kwashiorkor, you're going to see a child with a very large and distended belly. They are going to be lethargic, they are going to be irritable, they're going to have thinner hair that's going to be thinning, and they're going to have a very bloated belly. This is an example of a child with kwashiorkor. This is once again a protein deficiency. They lack a lot of important and crucial micronutrients, which are crucial vitamins and minerals that they need. 1/3 of the children in the world are lacking iodine. And that is, 1/3. That's a lot of children in the world that are missing iodine in their diet. This leads to cognitive deficits that can result in an IQ drop of 10 to 15 points. Now, countries like the United States and many developed countries have dealt with this iodine deficiency by creating iodized salt, where the iodine has been added to our table salt. And that provides us with that essential nutrient, iodine. So once again, in developed countries, specifically in the US, we have iodized salt, which helps us with that particular deficiency. The biggest problem that we see with children in the United States is an iron deficiency. 7% of our children on average in the United States are iron deficient. With Latino toddlers, that's the highest rate that we see, which is 12%. African American and white children, 6%. And this particular deficiency makes a toddler tired and irritable. And there are supplements that can be given to help with this deficiency. And a well-rounded, well-balanced diet can also prevent that type of deficiency. We're going to move right ahead to brain development in toddlerhood. During toddlerhood, we have an explosion of brain growth. If we think about how much our child has grown and changed from infancy to toddlerhood, consider a 6-month-old and their communication skills and their way they can express themselves, what they can do, and we compare that to a 2-year-old, we can see a huge difference. This is due to brain development and maturation of the brain. This period of time in toddlerhood is a very important period of very rapid growth. As you may recall from our previous lecture, we are born with more neurons than we will ever use. And remember, neurons are those building blocks of our brain. We have, at toddlerhood, about half of the neurons that we had at birth. So you're like, oh no, what happened? We started off with all these extra neurons. Why is it that by the time we reach toddlerhood, we only have half of the neurons that we had at birth? This is due to an interesting process that occurs. What happens is, the first thing that we talk about here is called exuberance. So what happens is we have a period of time where about 2 million connections per second are made. So synaptic density increases. Now, if you'll remember correctly, we have our neurons that don't actually touch. They communicate through electrochemical connections where a neurotransmitter is released and it travels across the synapse to talk to the neuron that's downstream from it. These synapses are the communication network. It's the connections between neurons. And what we see when we say we're talking about exuberance, we're talking about a whole bunch of extra connections being made. Think about how quickly our child from 1 to 2 years old, how much they're learning, how much they're growing, how much their mind is expanding. Their abilities are due to this explosion of connections being formed. With experiences, with everything they do, they're building new connections. This is especially happening a lot in the frontal cortex as well. And we'll get to that later. We're going to talk more about the frontal cortex probably in a little bit later period of time. The other thing that is happening is synaptic pruning. And this brings us back to, where did those connections go? What happened to all these neurons that we had? Where did everything go? Well, synaptic pruning is what has happened. Connections between neurons become fewer but more efficient. The development of the brain is kind of a use it or lose it type of situation. And I'm going to link a video in this section next to this video in our Canvas page that is going to talk a little bit about pruning, about synaptic pruning. So basically, those connections that we use, for example, to recognize faces, to recognize human faces, to understand our language that we speak, all of those connections are things that we need daily. So these connections are being strengthened, and we're getting more connections related to the people that we see. We're getting more connections related to the language that we're hearing. Whereas when we were first born, we have all of these extra capacity that can help us to understand all languages. Well, we don't need to understand all languages anymore. We need to understand the language that, or not to understand, but we have the capacity to learn to develop those languages. Better fix that one. So we don't need to learn to develop all those other languages. We need to learn to develop the language for the society that we're born into. So pretty soon, those extra connections that we are not going to be using, for me, for speaking Mandarin, those are going to be trimmed back because I'm only going to be speaking English. So this is an example of how that synaptic pruning occurs. We have the ability upon birth to recognize different types of primate faces. We don't necessarily need that ability. We need an ability to distinguish between the people that are around us, the difference between the different people. And so we will build those connections and grow those connections. And the ones to maybe recognize the differences between monkeys or lemurs or something, we don't need those. So those will be pruned back. This type of pruning makes the system more efficient. The connections that we need are strengthened and grow. The connections that we don't need are pruned back and removed. So 1/3 of the synapses are removed, but we're growing and making stronger those connections that we do use. Another intense period of this synaptic exuberance and synaptic pruning occurs in adolescence as well. This is a really cool image. This one is actually from your book. It is synaptic density compared at birth. Now remember, the synapses are those connections. That's the communications between the two neurons. It's those little gaps of communication. So at birth, we have tons of neurons, but they are not connecting to each other. They are not making communication with one another. At 1 month old, we start seeing more and more connections formed as we have more experiences and more exposure to the world. We are learning, we are growing and developing more synapses. By 3 months, we have more. By 15 months, more. By 24 months, we've got a huge spider web going on here. And that's what we like to see. All right, how do we measure brain activity in toddlers? Well, in toddlers, this is kind of the first time that we can use certain types of methods to measure brain activity. The EEG, which is an electroencephalogram, it measures electrical activity of the cerebral cortex. That's where you put the little electrodes on the head. You can kind of pop those onto babies. You can pop those onto toddlers and get a reading of what's going on there and measure the electrical activity just under the skull in this outer portion of the cerebral cortex. The fMRI, which is that functional magnetic resonance imaging, uses a magnetic field and records changes in the blood flow and oxygen. The premise behind this is that if a particular area of my brain is being active, it's going to have an increased blood flow. That increased blood flow is also going to have increased oxygen. So I can have somebody do a task in the fMRI machine, have them do a math problem, have them read poetry, have them do different things, and I can see what areas of their brain are being activated using this fMRI imaging. Toddlers, it's a little rough to actually do fMRI work with a toddler because they would have to hold very, very still. So really, the fMRI would have to be maybe for a little bit older child in most cases. Sleep patterns also change in toddlerhood. Toddlers sleep less than infants do. Our infants slept about 16 to 18 hours on average, where our toddlers will sleep about 12 to 13 hours. Those hours oftentimes are at night. A lot of times toddlers are finally getting to a point where they sleep longer periods during the night. They're not feeding as frequently, that sort of thing, so they are sleeping through the night better. Usually they only have about one nap in the day. And then just when things are getting kind of nice and a parent is feeling like, oh, I'm starting to finally get some rest, this kid is sleeping at night, they start waking again. And this frequent waking that starts to occur during this period is due to two main reasons. I mean, there could be other reasons, but the two most frequent causes are a resurgence of teething. They are starting to get more teeth. And of course, that's a painful process. And the other issue is that they become aware of separate sleeping arrangements. This is very much a Western issue. In traditional cultures, children sleep either with the father, because there might be another baby involved, or they're going to be staying with the mom, or they're going to be sleeping with the older siblings. So they're not really sleeping by themselves, so they don't have that whole separation thing going on. So in Western societies, however, toddlers are like, why is mom and dad in there and I'm in here? How come I have to sleep by myself? Or how come mom's in there and I'm in here? And they become very aware. They're developing their own little personhood, their own sense of self, and they're realizing the separation they have from their primary caregiver. So that's another reason for waking. I have placed up this cute little gross motor skills chart. Anybody who has had a baby or known somebody who has had a baby, parents tend to get a bit obsessed, in the Western cultures for sure, about when somebody meets a milestone. When is my baby sitting up by themselves? When can my baby roll over? When can my baby stand up? When can my baby start walking? There is a huge amount of variation in when an individual child will walk, will roll over, will stand, will do all of these different things on their own. So I just put this up here, and your book also has some charts about this. On average, about 3 months old, a baby will kind of be able to lift their head up a little bit, kind of do some funky stuff like that. By 5 months old, on average, they'll be rolling over. 6 months, sit in a tripod fashion, so kind of sit up on their own a little bit. 8 months, sit without any support. 9 months, stand with support, like holding their arms. Oftentimes they can kind of stand up if you hold their arms. 12 months, they can creep well. They walk but fall. In other words, they can kind of, they're by 12 months, they're definitely crawling around. They're able to maybe grab furniture, walk around. 18 months, they can kind of trot around a bit better. By 2 years old, they can go up and down stairs, they can jump. 3 years old, they can use alternating feet to go upstairs, whereas your 2-year-old is going to have to like hold something and then go 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, like that to go up the stairs. And then a 4-year-old hops on 1 foot and can use alternating feet going downstairs. Okay, so that's just kind of you can take a look at your book for these gross motor skill chart that they have in your book as well. Remember, these gross motor skills are these very large body motor movements. These are large muscle movements, like moving the whole body, moving your whole neck, moving your arm, moving your legs. These are gross motor skills. They involve large body movements, large muscle groupings. So gross. Oh, here's a little, I just put this in text form here so that you can get another look at it, but it's pretty much the same thing. Some cultures show slight variations, but development is comparable, because there are certain, as we've mentioned before, there are certain cultures that will hold the child like every moment of the day until they're 2 or 3 years old practically, due to their safety concerns. Well, by the age of 6, these kids all run and play and they're just as strong and able to climb and do all of these other things just as well as a child who has been able to stand and walk and be more independent from the time they were much younger. It doesn't seem to have a huge impact on later development. In toddlerhood, that's that big, oh, I'm missing one of my pictures. Oh no, I don't know where it went. Anyway, so this is one of those big milestones for our toddlers. We have here 9 to 16 months. Like I said, there's a great deal of variation as to when children start doing this. This one is just starting off with walking. You can see she's very thrilled with herself. And then we have this little one who is walking very precariously, but on her own. And then I had a really cute picture of another little boy running and kicking a soccer ball. So you have to just use your imagination on that one. Oh, hey, there he is. Apparently I did something fancy and didn't even know it. There we go. All right, fine motor skills involve smaller muscle groups. Though that would be learning dexterity, using your hands more carefully. We talked about in infancy, about 9 months old, children start to develop the pincer grip or pincer grip. It's where they can grab with their finger and thumb and try to get a Cheerio. That is a fine motor skill. That is fine motor development. Fine motor skills are focused on smaller movements, not the whole arm. Usually it's just the use of the hand or more delicate movements. At 12 months, can show left or right preference for eating. So at that point, by the time they start using a spoon on their own and doing all of that, you'll start seeing a preference for being right-handed or left-handed. They also would learn to hold a cup, scribble with a pencil, turn pages of a book. These are all skills that require fine motor development. In the second year, they expand those fine motor skills greatly. They develop a lot more coordination with their fine motor movements. And then here's a fabulous chart for the milestones of gross motor development in toddlerhood. Oh no, this is fine. Oops, okay. This is a mislabeled graph because it is actually fine motor development in toddlerhood. This one you can see in your book. Hopefully it's not mislabeled in there. All right, next we're going to talk about toilet training. Toilet training is a source of great stress for a lot of parents in the United States. In developed countries, the timing of toilet training has changed over time. In 1957, 92% of children were toilet trained by 18 months. In recent times, only 2.5% of children are toilet trained by 18 months. 60% are toilet trained by their 3rd birthday. And we have also found through certain research studies that people who have children that are, parents who are more highly educated from a higher socioeconomic class have children that are toilet trained later than others. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends toilet training somewhere in the range of 18 to 30 months. So anywhere in there seems to be kind of an average time to toilet train. So how do you know when it's time to toilet train? Well, there are certain signs of readiness that occur. These days, the American Pediatric Association recommends what we call a child-centered approach. This child-centered approach simply means let the child tell you when they're ready to start this process. And the way that they would tell you is by certain signs, by staying dry for over a couple of hours, by having a bowel movement at approximately the same time each day, by increased anticipation. For example, you know, a lot of times a kid that has to go have a bowel movement that's still in diapers might run off and hide behind the couch to do a bowel movement, or they may go find a spot to go have a bowel movement. So they anticipate this coming and they take action based on their anticipation of this event occurring. They might ask to use a toilet. They might ask for underwear. These are different things that can cue a parent in that this child may be ready to start that process. It is a long process, and there is a great deal of variation in it. 1/4 of 5-year-olds still have accidents. And these data here is based on Western culture, based on a more developed countries type of strategy here. Let's take a look at toilet training in developed countries. And the reason that toilet is in quotation marks is because a lot of these traditional cultures do not have actual toilets. They have an area that people go to use the restroom, or maybe a pit or somewhere like that, but they don't necessarily have toilets. There's actually organizations, groups in the world that go out to villages and places like this and actually provide toilets and teach them about that type of hygiene and about using toilets, and that is to protect their groundwater and to protect contamination and disease. So it's interesting that there are some groups that go out and actually provide toilets to people throughout the world, whether it's a pit toilet or whatever. Okay, and that's, I'm not saying that just because I think that, oh, gee, everybody should be westernized, everybody should have toilets like Western culture. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that some type of management of human waste needs to be in place in order to minimize the spread of disease and to minimize contamination of water. And that is why these groups go out and do this. Okay, thought I better clarify. Siblings, okay, so in these traditional cultures, siblings and older children usually are the ones that guide the toilet training. And you might better call it controlled elimination rather than toilet training, because there might not be a toilet. So basically the older children show the younger children where they're supposed to go to eliminate, where, you know, it's not going to be near the home. They're going to be reprimanded if it's done elsewhere. And as I said, usually there's no toilets. But this is something that in the Western cultures and developed countries is usually done by parents, whereas in a lot of traditional cultures, it's older children that are showing the younger ones how to manage elimination. All right, the weaning process. The weaning process is at about 2 to 3 years in traditional cultures. I know that I did mention earlier that sometimes in certain cultures, especially where food is scarce and starvation is a frequent factor in daily life, sometimes these children are weaned early and then they end up with kwashiorkor, we see marasmus and all these other things. However, if the mother is able to be continue breastfeeding and has adequate nutrition, in those circumstances, usually it's 2 to 3 years old before the child is weaned. And this seems to be a pattern that archaeologists have recognized throughout human history. So kind of that average 2 to 3 years. The thing about it is, and usually in Western cultures, we don't necessarily see breastfeeding occurring this late. I know personally, in my experience, I breastfed my kids until they were 1 year old. One of them just said, nope, I'm done. And they were getting the bottle also. So they had a combination of breast and bottle because I worked and had the pump and stuff. So they both kind of just said, I'm done with it at about 1 year old. So I guess I got lucky. However, what happens a lot of times in these traditional cultures is that, you know, mom's been breastfeeding for 2 years or 3 years, and it's time for this child to be weaned and to just be getting their nutrition from regular food. This can be a very difficult process. You have a 2 and 3 year old child who is used to breastfeeding, and we know that children at that age can be very stubborn about what they want, and especially when it comes to their food. So what is done sometimes in these cultures in order to assist with this this weaning from the breastfeeding is that a mother may coat her breast in tomato paste or something that's very unpleasant tasting, so that when the child goes to nurse, it just tastes nasty. So that's one way that they can do it. Some cultures just send the child away. They actually separate the mother and the child during this weaning process, where they might be sent out to the grandmother. And an example from your book is the Fulani people who separate the infants from their mothers during weaning. They go live with the grandmother. If the child is throwing a fit about eating, the grandmother may offer a breast, but obviously there's not going to be any food coming out of there, so the child gets discouraged from it quickly and gives up on the process. And then the mother and child are reunited after the process is completed. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. We have a couple more that we still need to do. I'm going to stop our screen share. I know I narrate all this because, you know, I'm just trying to figure this out. Okay, wow, bumpy ride. Okay, all righty. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I hope this lecture is helpful to help you get through the first portion of Chapter 5. Take care, stay safe, stay well. Until next time.